On the silent nights of the slave quarters, while the whip rested and the shackles rattled in the dark, a dream was born that no plantation master could ever erase: the pursuit of freedom. Deep in the forests, far from the big house and the cruel eyes of the overseer, enslaved men and women built secret communities. These places were not just hideouts, they were cities of hope, resistance, and life. They were the Quilombos. In this video, you will discover the true story of these refugees of freedom, from the desperate escapes of those who abandoned iron chains and the torment of the night, to the grandeur of Palmares and the immortal courage of Zumbi dos Palmares. This is not just a narrative about the past, but a mirror for the present, because by uncovering how the Quilombos were born in the midst of slavery, you will understand how the flame of resistance never went out. The history of slavery in Brazil begins with the forced arrival of millions of men, women, and even children ripped from the African continent. Transported in inhumane conditions inside slave ships, they were treated as worthless merchandise, stacked in damp holds, chained to one another, surrounded by iron restraints that not only bound their bodies, but also sought to imprison their dreams. Many did not survive the crossing, dying of hunger, disease, or despair. Those who did survive, upon stepping onto Brazilian soil, already bore on their bodies the marks of the torment and violence that would become routine in their new lives. From the moment they arrived on the plantations, their days were defined by oppression. The plantation master watched from the heights of the big house, imposing his absolute power over hundreds of enslaved people. In the fields, the overseer was the constant shadow, watchful and cruel, carrying the whip as a symbol of authority and fear. The bodies of the enslaved became books of scars, brands from hot iron, wounds carved by lashings, feet and hands mutilated as punishment for those who dared to run. The slave quarters, supposedly a place of rest, were in truth human warehouses, suffocating, foul and unsanitary, where dozens were crammed together on straw mats. Work began before sunrise and only ended when the moon was high. Men were forced to cut sugarcane until their bodies collapsed. Women were forced to carry heavy baskets, and many still endured the sexual violence of the plantation master during what was called the torment of the night. Children grew up witnessing punishments at the whipping post, where bodies were tied to the trunk and flogged in front of everyone as an example of terror. This daily violence was a system designed to break all hope, to remind each one that their life did not belong to them. Even so, resistance emerged in small gestures. A song hummed softly in the slave quarters, a prayer whispered by the straw bed, a hidden food that recalled distant Africa. These cultural memories were cries of survival in the face of a system that wanted to erase identities. The enslaved were forbidden to speak their languages, to practice their religions, or to keep their customs, yet they found ways to preserve their roots. It was a silent way of saying, "We are still us." The whipping post and the trunk were symbols of the master's power, but they also became symbols of injustice that ignited in many the desire to flee. Each crack of the whip reinforced the idea that life in the slave quarters was unbearable. For many, death seemed sweeter than continuing that existence without dignity, and it is at this point that the spark of freedom was born: escape. Because no matter how heavy the chains, no matter how vigilant the overseer, no matter how often the torment of the night was repeated, the flame of hope never died. It is important to understand that slavery in Brazil was not just an economic system. It was a machine of oppression designed to enrich the colonial elite at the expense of human suffering. The slave ships were only the beginning of this machine, which continued in the sugarcane fields, the coffee plantations, the mines, and in every region where enslaved bodies were exploited to their limits. Blood shed watered the fields of sugar and coffee, built churches, cities, and fortunes. The slave quarters were not just a physical place, but the symbol of an entire country built on shackles. And yet, it is in this landscape of pain that something grand flourished. Because in the face of violence, there was always resistance. Some rebelled openly, risking immediate death. Others planned long and dangerous escapes, using the darkness of night to flee. There were also those who sought help from unexpected allies, indigenous people who knew the forests, or even poor free men who offered shelter. Slavery tried to destroy, but it was precisely within it that one of the greatest expressions of courage in Brazilian history was born, the Quilombos. The chains that bound the bodies were not enough to extinguish the flame of freedom. The whip that tore the skin could not kill the spirit of resistance. The trunk that immobilized the arms did not stop minds from daring to dream. Because in the silence of the night, while the masters slept in the big house, the eyes of the enslaved turned to the forests, the rivers, the distant mountains. Out there, beyond oppression, there was the possibility of creating something new. And so, little by little, hope turned into action. Silent footsteps in the dark, secret trails through the forest, the courage to abandon everything in search of freedom. All of this would give rise to a movement that would change history. If the slave quarters represented the weight of slavery, the Quilombos were the answer. Living proof that even under the cruelest conditions, freedom always finds a way. And it was from this unstoppable desire to escape the chains, the trunk, and the whip that came the impulse that would transform fugitives into builders of freedom. In the next chapter, we will see how each solitary escape became entire communities, giving rise to the birth of Quilombos. Escaping the slave quarters was not just an act of courage, it was a leap into the unknown, driven by the burning desire to break free from shackles and regain stolen dignity. Many enslaved people spent entire nights secretly planning. In the heavy silence of dawn, after the torment of the night, they would look through the small crack of the wooden door and dream of the dark forest stretching beyond the plantation. For each man or woman who took the risk, escape meant both hope and condemnation. For being caught meant returning to the trunk, being flogged until the flesh tore open, or even losing hands, ears, or feet. Cruel punishments imposed by overseers. The decision to flee was never simple. Some planned in groups, trusting in bonds of solidarity, while others left alone, guided only by courage and the fear of staying. Many observed the routines of the overseer and the master, studying moments of carelessness, such as when the dogs were chained, or when patrols became lazier during religious festivals. Escape itself was an act of intelligence and resistance. Every step, every path, every water source had to be calculated. The forest offered shelter, but it was also full of dangers. Wild animals and the hunting expeditions of slave catchers could end the journey. The enslaved used ingenious strategies. They tied leaves to their feet to erase tracks, followed river courses to confuse pursuers, or hid in caves and crevices on hillsides. Sometimes indigenous allies offered shelter and guidance, knowing the secrets of the forest and the routes that led to safe havens. The distant sounds of the whipping post and the crack of whips echoed as reminders that there was no turning back. Fleeing was above all a one-way choice. But it was not only strong men who risked the journey. Women, often accompanied by young children, also dared to flee. They carried the little ones in their arms or tied to their backs, walking through the night, hiding during the day. Each step was a silent prayer that the cries of their children would not reveal their presence to the pursuers. It was female courage that many times allowed entire families to reach freedom in the distant forests. The capitans do mato were feared figures in this process. Hired by plantation masters, they knew the forest and were experts at tracking fugitives. Armed and accompanied by ferocious dogs, they hunted those who dared to leave the slave quarters. When someone was captured, the return was brutal. public punishments at the whipping post, lashings to death, or mutilations to serve as an example. Still, no violence was ever enough to stop escapes from happening, because stronger than fear was the desire for freedom. Many of these fugitives didn't know where they were going. Their only horizon was the hope of finding a place where the overseer could not reach them, where the whip no longer held power. Some sought dense forests, mountain ranges that were hard to access, or even areas near navigable rivers where they could escape more quickly. Others approached indigenous communities, forming survival alliances. Over time, these encounters would become fundamental for the formation of quilombos. Escape was not just an individual gesture, but also a collective act of resistance. Every man who got away showed others it was possible. Every woman who arrived in the forest, shelters with her children, reinforced the idea that freedom could be built. As escapes multiplied, plantation masters began to realize these were not isolated incidents, but a growing threat to the system of slavery. In the accounts of foreign travelers and in colonial documents, reports of escapes were constant. For the elite, fugitives were criminals, rebels, enemies of order. But in truth, they were invisible heroes who refused to accept a life in chains. Each escape was an open wound in the system, a reminder that the slave quarters could not contain the human spirit. The fear of capture did not extinguish the flame. On the contrary, the more violent the punishments at the trunk and the whipping post, the greater the number of enslaved people willing to risk everything. Each night, new footsteps echoed through the forests, new groups disappeared from the plantations. And the more escapes happened, the stronger the idea became of creating not just hideouts, but true free communities. This is how individual escapes began to transform into something much greater. Men and women who once hid alone realized that unity was the key to survival. Together, they could plant, hunt, build homes, and defend against attacks. Together, they could recreate a life of freedom, far from the oppression of the plantation masters. From that courage was born the seed of the Quilombos. Escapes ceased to be merely acts of desperation and became an organized movement. Every step taken outside the slave quarters was also a step toward the creation of entire communities. In the next chapter, we will see how these fugitives came together to found the first Quilombos, cities of freedom in the heart of slavery. When escapes began to multiply, it didn't take long before the paths taken by the enslaved led to unexpected encounters. Exhausted men who had fled a plantation on the coast crossed paths with women coming from the inland mines. Children who had survived the torment of the slave ships were welcomed by groups already settled in the forest. These encounters were not the fruit of chance. They were the beginning of something greater. There, in the heart of the forests, far from the big house and the cruelty of the overseer, Quilombos emerged. The term Quilombo has African origins, tied to groups of warriors and resistance camps. In colonial Brazil, it took on a new meaning. Free communities formed by fugitive enslaved people and their descendants, but not only them. Indigenous peoples persecuted and expelled from their lands also joined these groups, as did some poor whites and deserters seeking refuge from oppression. The Quilombo was, therefore, a space of encounter, of mixture, and of reinvention. The first Quilombos were small, often composed of only a few families who built their mud and thatch houses in hard-to-reach regions. Mountain ranges, riverbanks, and deep forest interiors were the preferred spots, as they made it harder for expeditions sent by plantation masters to penetrate. These spaces became true natural fortresses. The tall trees hid secret trails, the rivers served as escape routes, and the stones of the mountains acted as barriers against attacks. Over time, some Quilombos grew into complex communities. They planted cassava, corn and beans, raised animals, produced tools, and even rudimentary weapons for defense. Solidarity was the foundation of collective life. Each member contributed with their skills, and everyone shared what they produced. Social organization was marked by councils of leaders chosen for their experience and courage, and African traditions blended with indigenous and European practices. The Quilombos were also spaces of cultural preservation. In the drum beats, the dances, the African-based religions, and the stories told around the fire, the memory of peoples that slavery tried to erase remained alive. Songs in African languages, forbidden in the slave quarters, echoed freely in the forest. The body once flogged at the whipping post could now move in dances of celebration. The spirit once broken at the trunk was now strengthened in rituals of resistance. These communities were seen by colonial society as a direct threat to the system of slavery. For plantation masters, each Quilombo was a reminder that chains could not contain freedom. Overseers feared that enslaved people in the quarters would be inspired by these stories of escape and courage. And indeed, the Quilombos became beacons of hope. With every enslaved person who managed to escape and find shelter, news spread that life outside the plantations was possible. The Quilombos also practiced defensive warfare. Many set up guards at the entrances to trails, organized ambushes against the capitans do mato, and knew every detail of the local geography, using the forest as an ally. Armed with spears, bows, arrows, and when possible, firearms obtained through trade or ambushes, they resisted the expeditions sent to destroy them. Each failed attack increased the group's confidence and proved that slavery, though powerful, was not invincible. For those still trapped in the slave quarters, hearing about the Quilombos was like receiving a secret message. Between the crack of the whip and the exhaustion of labor, someone would whisper, "In the mountains there are cities of free people." These words fueled dreams, strengthened spirits, and increased the number of fugitives. The Quilombos stopped being just a hiding place and became a symbol of collective struggle. As the decades passed, Quilombos multiplied across the Brazilian territory. On the coast, in the backlands, in the mining regions, and even near colonial towns, there was always a group challenging the established order. They were not only spaces of survival, but true alternatives of society. While the big house sustained itself on blood, the trunk, and the torment of the night, the Quilombos were built on solidarity, memory, and the desire for freedom. With each new Quilombo, the fear of the colonial elite grew. Documents of the time described these communities as dens of criminals or enemies of the crown. But behind those words lay the uncomfortable truth. Quilombos proved that it was possible to live outside the system of slavery. And that possibility in itself was revolutionary. It was in this setting that the greatest and most powerful of all Quilombos was born, Palmares. Located in the region that today belongs to Alagoas and Pernambuco, Palmares was not just a refuge, it was an entire nation built in the midst of persecution. With thousands of inhabitants, its own political structure, agricultural production, trade, and organized defense, Palmares became the greatest symbol of black resistance in the Americas. If the first Quilombos showed that freedom was possible, Palmares showed that it could be lasting, organized, and undefeated for nearly a century. In the next chapter, we will dive into the history of Palmares, the capital of freedom in the midst of slavery. Among all the Quilombos that emerged in colonial Brazil, none reached the grandeur and strength of Palmares. Located in the Serra da Barriga region between Pernambuco and Alagoas, Palmares was not just a temporary hideout. It was a true nation that resisted for nearly 100 years, defying the order of slavery and becoming the greatest symbol of freedom in the midst of captivity. Its name, passed from mouth to mouth among the enslaved in the quarters, was synonymous with hope. When someone whispered Palmares, they were not speaking only of a place, but of a collective dream of liberation. Palmares' growth began with small communities formed by fugitives. Little by little, these groups united, forming larger settlements known as Quilombos. It is estimated that Palmares came to shelter between 20 and 30,000 inhabitants, a number that made it larger than many colonial towns of the time. This scale revealed not only the courage of the fugitives, but also their capacity for organization and social building under extremely adverse conditions. Palmares' structure was impressive in its complexity. There were agricultural areas where cassava, corn, beans, and fruits were cultivated. There was animal husbandry, tool-making, and even trade with nearby towns, often carried out clandestinely. The quilombolas exchanged agricultural products for weapons, textiles, and other essential items, showing that Palmares did not live in isolation but interacted with the outside world, albeit at great risk. This network of exchange strengthened the community and ensured its survival. Life in Palmares was marked by cultural diversity. There you would find descendants of different African peoples, indigenous groups, and even poor Europeans seeking refuge. This mix gave rise to a plural society where traditions intertwined. African-based religions coexisted with indigenous practices, while elements of Christianity were reinterpreted through the lens of resistance. Music, dance, and rituals were fundamental to collective life, serving as cultural expression and also as instruments of unity. Palmares' political organization also stood out. Quilombos were governed by local leaders, but there was a central structure that coordinated defense and administration across the region. For a long time, Zumbi was recognized as Palmares' supreme leader, establishing a kind of reign that, even without formal titles, demonstrated the community's capacity for self-government. Later, Zumbi dos Palmares would take on this role, becoming the eternal symbol of resistance. Militarily, Palmares was practically impregnable. Located in a hard-to-reach area surrounded by mountain ranges and dense forests, the Quilombo benefited from the geography. In addition, the quilombolas developed effective guerrilla tactics. They knew every trail, every rock, every river. They used ambushes, swift attacks, and strategic retreats that confounded their enemies. Bandeirantes, slave catchers, and colonial expeditions were sent countless times to destroy Palmares, but almost always returned defeated, humbled by the skill of the quilombola warriors. With each victory, Palmares' fame grew. Enslaved people on distant plantations heard accounts that there was a city of free black people who stood up to the plantation masters and survived. These stories fueled new escapes. Thus, Palmares became not only a refuge, but also a beacon lighting the path of resistance. For many, reaching Palmares was like arriving at a promised land where iron chains, the trunk, and the whipping post did not exist. However, Palmares also faced internal challenges. Life among different cultural groups generated tensions, and the constant need for defense demanded discipline and organization. Zumbi, for example, negotiated a peace agreement with colonial authorities, accepting freedom only for some quilombolas in exchange for the submission of others. This agreement caused divisions, and many saw it as a betrayal of the spirit of resistance. It was in this context that the figure of Zumbi arose, refusing to accept any concession short of full freedom for everyone. Palmares' struggle against the colonizers was long and bloody. Several armed expeditions were sent to destroy it. In 1676, a major offensive led by Domingos Jorge Velho, a bandeirante notorious for his brutality, attacked Palmares with well-armed troops. Although they inflicted serious damage, the quilombolas resisted. In 1694, however, an even more powerful expedition managed to invade the Serra da Barriga and destroy much of the Quilombo. It was a devastating blow. But even then, it did not extinguish the flame of resistance. What is striking is that Palmares survived for nearly a century, an extraordinary feat in the face of the colonial system's violence. While plantations rose and fell, while entire generations were crushed under the weight of chains, Palmares endured as living testimony that freedom was possible. This longevity shows it was not an isolated group, but an organized society capable of resisting the largest slave system in the Americas. The destruction of Palmares did not mean the end of its story. On the contrary, it transformed it into myth. Every Quilombo that emerged afterward carried something of Palmares. Every man and woman who dared to flee the slave quarters and defy the overseer drew inspiration from that nation of freedom that had resisted for so long. Palmares was not just a page of history, it was an entire chapter written with blood, courage, and hope. When the plantation masters finally celebrated Palmares' destruction, they believed they had won. But what truly happened was that Palmares became eternal. Its heroes, its songs, and its battles echoed beyond time. And at the center of that memory, one name stood out as the greatest symbol of the struggle: Zumbi dos Palmares. Palmares showed that freedom could become a society, but it was Zumbi who gave that resistance a face and a voice. In the next chapter, we will delve into the life, myth, and legacy of Zumbi dos Palmares, the hero who chose death over submission. Among all the names tied to resistance against slavery, none resonates as powerfully as Zumbi dos Palmares. He was not merely a military leader, but a symbol of courage, strategy, and unwavering defiance in the face of oppression. His story crossed centuries, becoming myth and inspiration for generations who continue to fight against racism and for freedom. Zumbi was born in Palmares around 1655. As a child, he was captured during one of the expeditions sent to destroy the Quilombo. Given to a priest, he received a Christian education, learned Portuguese and Latin, and was baptized Francisco. Yet even amid attempts at assimilation, the flame of freedom within him never went out. At 15, Zumbi fled the colonial environment and returned to Palmares, where he quickly stood out for his intelligence and courage. Over the years, Zumbi became a brilliant military strategist. He knew the trails of the Serra da Barriga like few others and understood how to use the geography in favor of resistance. He led quick ambushes, planned surprise attacks, and organized defenses that confounded even the most experienced bandeirantes. Under his leadership, Palmares withstood powerful expeditions, facing firearms with spears, bows, arrows, and a discipline born from the certainty that freedom was worth more than life itself. But Zumbi was not only a warrior, he was also a leader who inspired trust. His refusal to accept agreements that freed only part of the Quilombolas revealed his collective vision. While Ganga Zumba sought a settlement that left many at the mercy of slavery, Zumbi held to the end that there could be no true freedom, while a single brother or sister remained chained in the slave quarters. This stance made him not only a military chief, but a moral guide for Palmares. Zumbi's figure grew so much that to the plantation masters he became the #1 enemy. Colonial documents speak of him with hatred and fear, describing him as stubborn and tireless. For the enslaved, however, Zumbi was synonymous with hope. In the slave quarters, his name circulated in whispers like a prayer. For every man flogged at the trunk, for every woman violated in the big house, the memory that someone was defying the system kept the flame of resistance alive. The hunt for Zumbi was relentless. In 1694, after one of the largest offensives against Palmares, many Quilombolas were massacred. Zumbi, however, managed to escape. For months, he survived hidden in the forests, moving skillfully and protected by the trust of allies. But betrayal came from where it was least expected. In 1695, denounced by a former companion, Zumbi was surprised and captured. Even wounded, he fought to the very last moment but was killed. His body was decapitated and his head displayed publicly in Recife as a warning to anyone who dared challenge the slave system. The colonizers sought to erase his memory through the humiliation of death, but they achieved the exact opposite. His martyrdom turned Zumbi into a myth. His image crossed the centuries as an eternal cry for freedom, proving that the courage of one man can become the inheritance of an entire people. Zumbi's legacy is so powerful that his memory survived even the silence imposed by official history. For a long time, colonial documents tried to portray him as a criminal or a rebel, but oral tradition preserved his true essence. That of a leader who never bowed, who chose death over submission. In the 20th century, black movements reclaimed his story, and November 20th, the date of his death, came to be celebrated as Black Consciousness Day, recognizing Zumbi as a national hero. Today, Zumbi is more than a historical figure. He is a symbol of the fight against structural racism, against inequality, and against all forms of oppression that still persist. His life shows that freedom is not a concession, but a conquest. His blood, shed in Palmares, still speaks to present generations, reminding us that resistance is an essential part of Black identity in Brazil. If Zumbi gave a face and voice to the struggle, the Quilombos gave body and soul to that resistance. To understand the depth of their importance, we must look beyond the battles. We must see how life was lived inside these free communities. In the next chapter, we will dive into the daily life of the Quilombos and discover how, in the midst of persecution, a culture of solidarity and freedom flourished. If in the slave quarters bodies were treated as merchandise and every movement was watched by the overseer, in the Quilombos, a completely different world was born, built upon solidarity and hope. Life within these communities was marked by simplicity, yet carried profound meaning. Every detail revealed that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the chance to rebuild dignity and identity. The homes were made of clay, wood, and straw, built in strategic locations, often invisible to the naked eye. Houses were clustered around collective fields where cassava, corn, beans, and sweet potatoes were cultivated. There was also space for medicinal gardens that preserved African and indigenous knowledge of healing and health. These practices were essential for survival since no colonial doctor would treat fugitives. Thus, life in the Quilombos relied on communal work and the oral transmission of traditions. Daily life in the Quilombos was defined by sharing. Unlike the big house, where hierarchy maintained privilege, the spirit of community prevailed in the Quilombos. Men hunted and defended the territory, women cultivated the land and cared for children, but always with flexibility and mutual support. Tasks were distributed according to the group's needs, not by the imposition of a master. This form of organization showed that even in the midst of persecution, it was possible to build societies based on cooperation. Cultural preservation held a central role. At night, around the fires, drums echoed, African dances gained strength, and songs in languages forbidden in the slave quarters became songs of freedom. Each drumbeat was also an act of resistance against forgetting. African-based religions blended with indigenous practices, and in some cases, even with popular Catholicism. This spiritual diversity strengthened collective identity and nourished hope. In the Quilombos, children grew up free. While in the slave quarters they were forced to work from an early age, here they had time to play, learn from their elders, and listen to stories about their ancestors. Childhood in the Quilombos was the clearest symbol that freedom could be lived. There were no whips, no torment of the night, no trunks. There was discipline, but it was rooted in care and survival. This difference shaped generations and reinforced a sense of belonging. Life in the Quilombos also revolved around defense. At any moment, bandeirantes or colonial expeditions could appear. That is why lookouts were spread across strategic points, always alert to signs of movement. In case of attack, everyone participated in resistance. Men wielded improvised weapons, women helped hide children and the elderly, and some groups relied on traps prepared along the trails. This constant vigilance shaped daily life, but also reinforced unity. Despite persecution, Quilombos maintained contact with the outside world. There was clandestine trade with nearby towns, where agricultural products were exchanged for salt, tools, and even weapons. In some cases, poor free people and even marginalized whites found in the Quilombos a refuge from misery. This network of exchange demonstrated that Quilombos were not isolated, but part of a social fabric connecting different realities. The most striking aspect of life in the Quilombos was the recreation of Africa on Brazilian soil. Rhythms, food, rites of passage. Everything carried the memory of a continent that slavery sought to erase. This cultural preservation was a silent victory against the plantation masters. Every festival held, every chant sung, every ritual celebrated was a reminder that chains could not suffocate the soul. But life in the Quilombos was not free from hardship. Food shortages, tropical diseases, the constant threat of attacks, and internal tensions demanded daily courage. Still, for those who had known the trunk, the whipping post and the lash, living in freedom was worth any sacrifice. The Quilombo was not a paradise, but it was proof that an alternative society could exist in the midst of slavery. This way of life inspired those still trapped in the slave quarters. Stories of feasts, abundant harvests, and warriors who faced the bandeirantes circulated in whispers, awakening in hearts the desire to flee. The mere existence of a place where black people, indigenous groups, and even poor whites lived together in freedom was already an affront to the colonial system. The Quilombos became therefore more than refuges. They were schools of resistance, guardians of African memory, and laboratories of freedom. While plantation masters leaned on the power of the big house, the quilombolas built a new way of life where dignity mattered more than wealth. This experience of freedom, however, was constantly threatened. Plantation masters, fearing the influence of quilombos on the enslaved, organized expeditions of destruction. Bandeirantes, slave catchers, and colonial soldiers hunted these communities with brutal violence. In the next chapter, we will see how repression intensified and how even under siege, the Quilombos continued to resist. The more the Quilombos grew, the more they became a nightmare for plantation masters and the colonial structure. Each free community represented a threat to the system because it proved that slavery was not invincible. And the more enslaved people fled the quarters and joined the Quilombos, the greater the concern of the elite. These territories had to be destroyed at any cost, and for that purpose, armed expeditions, bandeirantes, and slave catchers were mobilized, all determined to crush emerging freedom. The plantation masters saw the Quilombos as dens of criminals. In documents of the time, they were described as centers of rebellion, accused of theft, murder, and disorder. In reality, this rhetoric was an attempt to justify the violence they planned. The truth is that Quilombos posed not only an economic threat by reducing the captive labor force, but also a symbolic one because they challenged the very idea that black people should remain chained under the dominance of the big house. Expeditions against the Quilombos were made up of colonial soldiers, seasoned bandeirantes, and slave catchers trained to track fugitives. They carried firearms, ferocious dogs, and siege equipment. Many of these attacks took place by surprise, in the dead of night, when they believed they would find the quilombolas off guard. But the forest was the greatest ally of the resistance. Quilombola warriors knew every trail, every river, every stone of the mountains. They organized ambushes, set traps, and used guerrilla tactics that confused their enemies. Even so, the battles were bloody. When a Quilombo was discovered, confrontation was inevitable. Women, men, and even teenagers took part in the defense. Warriors fought with bows, arrows, spears, and, when possible, weapons obtained through ambushes or clandestine trade. Each attack was also a massacre, and many Quilombolas fell in combat. But even in the face of violence, courage prevailed. For those who had already felt the weight of the trunk, the whip, and the whipping post, dying in battle was preferable to returning to the slave quarters. The bandeirantes became infamous for their brutality. One of the most notorious, Domingos Jorge Velho, led devastating expeditions against Palmares. His reputation was built on violence, indigenous villages destroyed, quilombos burned, hundreds of men and women killed. These attacks were financed by plantation masters and by the crown, who saw the Quilombos as a threat to social and economic order. Each expedition was, therefore, an investment in the maintenance of the slave system. Despite constant offensives, many Quilombos managed to resist for years. The secret was mobility. When a Macambo was attacked, survivors fled and joined other communities. Thus, even when colonial expeditions celebrated the destruction of one Quilombo, another would soon rise elsewhere. This resilience made repression almost useless. No matter how hard they tried to erase the Quilombos, they were reborn like flames spreading across the land. The punishments for captured Quilombolas were horrific. Many were hanged or quartered in public squares as warnings to those who might think of escaping. Others were branded with hot iron, mutilated, and returned to the slave quarters to serve as examples. The whipping post once again became a stage for torture, where stripped bodies were flogged to the edge of life. Yet no matter how cruel these punishments were, they could not extinguish the desire for freedom. On the contrary, each execution reinforced the certainty that the struggle was just. The plantation masters and colonial authorities knew that destroying the Quilombos required more than military force. It was also a psychological battle. They wanted to spread fear, to create the sense that resistance was futile. But the memory of Quilombola victories, the stories of Palmares, and the deeds of warriors like Zumbi showed that freedom could be achieved. Thus, repression, no matter how brutal, never managed to suffocate the spirit of resistance. Over time, some communities began to organize themselves even more strategically. They chose hard-to-reach locations, built rudimentary fortifications, and reinforced alliances with indigenous groups and other marginalized communities. This union made the Quilombos even harder to defeat. Colonial repression, however violent, was never able to completely eliminate this form of resistance. The image of Quilombos as cities of freedom spread through the slave quarters. Even when some were destroyed, the idea that there existed a place where chains had no power continued to circulate. This myth was stronger than any whipping post. Each word whispered at night, each song sung in secret. Each successful escape kept alive the flame that freedom was possible. Repression revealed the brutality of the colonial system, but it also exposed the resilience of the Quilombolas. Even in the face of massacres, communities were reborn and multiplied. In the next chapter, we will see how Quilombos spread across Brazil, taking on diverse forms and keeping alive the struggle for freedom. Although Palmares is the most famous, Quilombos spread across the entire Brazilian territory. From north to south, in rural areas and even near colonial towns, communities emerged formed by men, women, and children who refused to accept the weight of chains. These Quilombos varied in size, but all had something in common. They were living symbols of resistance against slavery. In Rio de Janeiro, for example, Quilombos existed in the mountain ranges surrounding the city. Some were so close that they could observe the movement of the big house and the slave quarters. These urban quilombos were particularly feared as they facilitated mass escapes. Enslaved people who worked as porters, street vendors, or even artisans in the city found in the nearby forests a path to freedom. Proximity to urban centers also allowed clandestine trade, strengthening these communities. In Minas Gerais, during the gold cycle, quilombos arose in mountainous, hard-to-reach regions. Enslaved people working in the mines, subjected to exhausting shifts and constant surveillance, seized any chance to escape. Many took with them tools, mining knowledge, and even small amounts of gold stolen from the mines. These resources were used to barter for food, weapons, and alliances with neighboring communities. The Quilombos of Minas were thus centers of survival, but also of economic resistance. In Maranhão and Pará, Quilombos expanded across the vast Amazon rainforest. There, geography was a powerful ally. Mighty rivers, mangroves, and dense forests made it difficult for slave catchers to enter. Furthermore, alliances with indigenous peoples were crucial. Together, quilombolas and indigenous groups created networks of protection, exchanged knowledge, and strengthened their ability to resist. These northern quilombos reveal how the struggle against slavery was also a struggle for the preservation of land and forest. In São Paulo, along the trade routes that connected the interior to the coast, quilombos appeared in strategic locations. They attacked convoys, freed enslaved people, and disrupted the transport of wealth. They were seen as a direct threat to the colonial economy. The constant presence of quilombos along these routes showed that there was no region untouched by resistance. Each quilombo, no matter how small, represented a challenge to colonial power. These communities did not live only by fleeing and defending. Like Palmares, many smaller quilombos developed their own forms of social organization. There was farming, livestock raising, festivals, religious rituals, and even improvised schools where elders passed knowledge to new generations. Each quilombo was a seed of freedom, preserving African memories, blending with indigenous cultures, and creating new ways of life. The impact of these quilombos was profound. For plantation masters, they represented constant losses of labor. For the enslaved still trapped, they were beacons of hope. The simple fact of knowing that somewhere in the mountains or forests men and women lived free already weakened the power of the trunk and the whipping post. The whip could punish bodies, but it could not silence the imagination of those who dreamed of the quilombo. Colonial authorities recorded countless attacks on smaller quilombos. Often, these communities were burned, their residents killed or recaptured. Yet even in the face of this violence, the quilombos multiplied. Each destruction gave rise to new groups, spreading resistance like roots extending underground. It was impossible to completely control this movement because it sprang from the very essence of humanity, the unbreakable desire to be free. Over time, the existence of quilombos became an inseparable part of the history of slavery in Brazil. They were not isolated exceptions, but constant phenomena. They were in the mountains of the southeast, in the forests of the north, in the plains of the northeast, and even on the outskirts of large towns. Colonial Brazil, sustained by the violence of the plantation master, the overseer, and the torment of the night, coexisted side by side with territories that defied this order. These quilombos were also responsible for preserving traditions that would otherwise have been lost. Cuisine, music, dances, religious rituals, and even African linguistic expressions survived thanks to these communities. At the same time, they created new cultural forms, blending African, indigenous, and poor European elements. This fusion gave rise to practices that still shape Brazilian identity today. It must be remembered that in each region the quilombos took on their own characteristics. Some were small and mobile, constantly changing location to avoid pursuit. Others were large and stable, with hundreds of people and organized structures. But all, without exception, shared the same essence. They were spaces where the trunk, the whipping post, and the chains had no power. These quilombos scattered across Brazil showed that resistance was not limited to one place or one people, but was the collective act of all who refused to accept slavery. In the next chapter, we will see how this legacy crossed centuries and remains alive today in recognized quilombola communities, in collective memory, and in the struggle against structural racism. The Quilombos did not remain only in the distant memory of slavery. They endured through time and became living communities that still today maintain traditions, preserve histories, and continue fighting for rights. Contemporary Brazil is home to hundreds of officially recognized quilombola communities spread across every state. These territories, direct heirs of the courage of fugitives who defied plantation masters, are proof that the freedom conquered in the past still must be defended in the present. In quilombola communities, cultural heritage is tangible. The music of drums, circular dances, religious festivals, and rituals of African origin remain alive. Cuisine, with dishes prepared from knowledge brought from Africa and adapted to Brazil, is also a link between generations. These cultural elements are not just traditions, but tools of resistance against historical erasure. Each song sung, each recipe passed down, each celebration held is a political act of identity affirmation. The official recognition of these communities is the result of a long struggle. For centuries, the descendants of quilombolas were made invisible, living on lands conquered by their ancestors without full rights over them. Only with the 1988 Constitution did Brazil recognize the right to the titling of quilombola lands. Since then, hundreds of communities have begun processes to secure legal ownership of the territories where they live. This right, however, still faces resistance, bureaucracy, and conflicts with large landowners and economic interests. Quilombola communities do not fight only for land. They also demand access to quality education, healthcare, sanitation, and public policies that respect their cultural specificities. Many quilombola schools, for example, work with differentiated curricula that value history and local traditions so that new generations grow up knowing and respecting their own identity. This education is in itself a continuation of the resistance begun by the ancestors who built the original quilombos. The quilombola struggle is also a struggle against structural racism. The same logic of exclusion that once put men and women in the trunk, at the whipping post, and in the slave quarters still manifests today in social and economic inequalities. Quilombola communities face higher rates of poverty, lack of infrastructure, and violence. Yet the memory of past resistance strengthens the courage to face these adversities. The legacy of Palmares and of Zumbi dos Palmares echoes as spiritual strength to continue resisting. In addition, contemporary quilombos are guardians of nature. Many are located in areas of great biodiversity, where they preserve forests, rivers, and sacred territories. Traditional knowledge of sustainable agriculture, natural medicine, and living in harmony with the environment are inheritances that dialogue with current challenges such as the climate crisis. Defending quilombos today is also defending Brazil's environmental balance. Quilombola festivals, such as November 20th, Black Consciousness Day, are moments of celebration and reflection. In these gatherings, communities remember their ancestors, reinforce their collective identity, and claim their place in society. The dancing body, the sound of drums, the collective chants are not just cultural celebrations, but declarations that the struggle continues. Memory is not a museum, it is a living flame that warms each generation. In major urban centers, the quilombola legacy also manifests itself. Black movements, cultural collectives, and artists reclaim the history of quilombos as inspiration to confront present-day inequalities. The myth of Zumbi, once seen only as a historical figure, is today a symbol of political resistance. He represents the refusal to accept oppression and the courage to fight for social justice. In every act against racism, in every protest for equality, the same voice echoes that once resounded in the forests of Palmares. This legacy also connects to spirituality. Many Quilombos preserve Afro-Brazilian religious traditions, such as candomblé and umbanda, which endured despite persecution and prejudice. These practices are more than faith. They are expressions of a worldview that values ancestry, nature, and community. For quilombolas, to pray, sing, and dance is to continue the resistance against centuries of cultural violence. Thus, the quilombo is the present, not only the past. It is community, identity, and struggle. It is a symbol that freedom was not a gift granted by the elite, but a conquest won through blood and courage. It is living memory that slavery tried to silence a people but could not destroy their soul. The Quilombos continue to exist, not only as physical places, but as eternal symbols of resistance. In the next chapter, we will close this journey by remembering that the flame of freedom was never extinguished, and that it is up to us to keep alive the legacy of those who chose to fight. From slave ships packed with iron chains to the quarters watched over by overseers, from the pain of the trunk and the whipping post to the scars left by the lash, slavery tried to turn people into shadows. But the Quilombos showed that freedom always finds a way. Each escape, each community built in the forests, each battle won against colonial expeditions was a cry that echoed across centuries. Palmares, Zumbi dos Palmares, Ganga Zumba, and so many others, known and unknown, wrote a history of resistance that could never be erased. Today, that legacy remains alive in quilombola communities, in social movements, in Black consciousness celebrations, and in every act of those who refuse to accept racism and inequality as destiny. The Quilombo is not just a place in the forest. It is an eternal symbol of courage and dignity. Remembering this story is more than an act of memory. It is a commitment to the present and to the future, because the chains have changed form, but the struggle for justice remains. The flame lit by the drums of Palmares still burns, calling us to resist, to fight, and to dream. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and help keep alive the memory of those who chose to face slavery with courage. Because when we remember the Quilombos, we are not only speaking of the past, we are speaking of ourselves, of our present, and of the hope for a freer future.